Hi everyone, how are you? Are we ready for our story? If you've got your coffee and are sitting back comfortably, let's get started. First of all, please subscribe and leave a comment. Chapter being The Village at its quietest hour. Long after the curfew bell had rung, long after the last glow of evening firelight had faded to a dim bed of ash beneath careful layers of covering, a medieval village settled into the deepest and quietest hours of its night. To walk through such a village after midnight, if any observer had possessed the means to do so safely and unseen, would have revealed a world almost entirely still, its narrow lanes empty, its small timber and thatch houses dark and silent, and its inhabitants, almost without exception, asleep beneath whatever wool and fur covering their household could provide against the cold. Yet stillness is not the same as emptiness, and the hours after midnight in a medieval village, however quiet, were never entirely without activity or without purpose. Somewhere in the darkness, a watchman continued his rounds. A baker began the earliest preparations for the coming day. A mother tended Ed, a restless infant, and the ordinary, unglamorous mechanics of a community's survival continued quietly onward, even as the great majority of its people slept. This is the story of what genuinely happened inside a medieval village during these deep, dark hours, drawn from the surviving evidence of manorial records, guild regulation, chronicled anecdote, and the patient work of historians who have reconstructed, piece by careful piece, the authentic rhythm of medieval nighttime life. Chapter Iki, Footsteps in the Dark. Among the very few people genuinely awake and moving through a medieval village after midnight was the night watchman, a role filled, as discussed in earlier accounts of medieval civic life, through a combination of formal obligation and, in some communities, paid employment, and tasked with patrolling the settlement's lanes and boundaries through the deepest hours of the night. Surviving manorial and borough records describe the watchman's duties in reasonably specific terms, including checking that doors and shutters remained properly secured, watching for any sign of fire, and remaining alert for the kind of disturbance, whether accidental or result of deliberate wrongdoing, that required immediate attention before it could grow into something more serious. The watchman's equipment, so far as surviving records and artistic depictions allow reconstruction, typically included a simple lantern or torch, providing the only mobile source of light within the otherwise dark settlement, along with a staff or similar weapon for basic self-defense and the enforcement of order should it prove necessary.
Walking alone or in a small rotating group through lanes, light nothing more than this single carried flame, the watchman represented the village's primary active defense against the genuine practical dangers of the night already discussed in earlier accounts, his footsteps, and the occasional call, confirming that all remained well, serving as one of the very few sounds of active human presence within an otherwise profoundly silent settlement. Chapter 3. Behind every closed door. Within the small timber-framed houses lining our medieval village's lanes, the great majority of its population lay asleep in exactly the arrangement described in earlier accounts of medieval sleeping practice. Entire families sharing a single bed or communal pallet, wrapped in whatever combination of wool blankets, retained daytime clothing, and shared body warmth their household could provide. The interior of such a house after night would have been almost entirely dark, any light limited to the faint, barely visible glow of a carefully banked hearth fire, its embers covered with ash, and reduced to the smallest possible smolder consistent with preserving a spark for the following morning. Sleep itself, within these close, shared medieval sleeping arrangements, was very likely not the single, unbroken stretch familiar to many people today, and historians studying pre-industrial surreal sleep patterns more broadly have noted evidence drawn from a range of historical sources beyond this, specifically medieval context, suggesting that many pre-industrial populations experienced a segmented pattern of nighttime sleep, waking briefly during the deep hours of night, before returning to a second period of rest before dawn. Whatever the precise pattern of any individual household's sleep, the interior of an ordinary medieval home after midnight would have remained a place of quiet, shared warmth and rest, disturbed only occasionally by a restless child, a settling animal in an adjoining space. A household member responding to some minor need before returning to sleep. Chapter. The fire that never fully died. The carefully banked hearth fire, discussed in considerable detail in earlier accounts of medieval household management, represented one of the few points of continuous, if minimal, activity within an otherwise sleeping medieval hours at midnight. Reduced to a small, carefully insulated core of glowing embers beneath its protective layer of ash, this fire required no active tending through the deepest hours of the night. Yet its continued, slow smolder represented a genuinely important practical asset, preserving a source of ready flame. Would save a household the considerable difficulty of striking an entirely new fire from cold stone and iron once morning arrived. This banked fire also continued to offer a small, residual measure of warmth to the sleeping household throughout the night, and the physical proximity of a family's sleeping arrangement to the hearth itself, discussed in earlier accounts of medieval house design, ensured that even this minimal remaining heat contributed meaningfully to the household's collective effort to remain warm enough through the coldest hours of a winter night. In villages where livestock shared adjoining space with the family, as discussed in earlier accounts of medieval rural life, the quiet shifting and settling of these animals through the night added its own additional, if modest, contribution of warmth, and, for any household member who happened to briefly wake, a familiar and reassuring sound confirming that all remained ordinary and undisturbed within the small, dark world of the sleeping house. Chapter Beige, The Miller's Early Start. Among the very few village residents whose occupation genuinely required activity during the hours before dawn was the miller, whose water-powered or wind-powered mill served as an essential piece of communal agricultural infrastructure, grinding the grain upon which the entire village's bread. Supply ultimately depended. Surviving records concerning the operation of medieval mills, including manorial accounts and occasional disputes recorded in court proceedings, confirm that mills frequently operated across an extended that could include the very early hours of the morning, particularly during the busier periods of the agricultural calendar, when the volume of grain requiring processing placed genuine pressure on the mill's available operating hours. A miller beginning preparation for the day's work in the hours before dawn would have moved through a village still largely asleep, tending to the practical mechanical requirements of his mill, whether checking a water wheel's sluice gates or preparing a windmill sails for the day's expected wind, tasks that required his presence and attention well before the great majority of his fellow villagers had risen from their beds. This early activity reflected the broader practical reality that certain essential village occupations, tied directly to natural cycles of water flow, wind, or the rising of dew that the following chapter will address, could not always be confined neatly within the ordinary daylight working hours that governed the great majority of medieval agricultural labor. Chapter 8: Bread Before Dawn. The village baker, where a settlement possessed sufficient size and communal infrastructure to support one or the individual households responsible for their own baking in smaller settlements, lacking a dedicated communal oven, faced a genuine practical necessity for very early activity. Since the production of bread required a preparation timeline that frequently extended back into the hours well before dawn, dough, once mixed and allowed to rise, required careful timing to ensure it reached the proper state for baking at an hour that would allow finished bread to be available for the village's ordinary morning needs. A timeline that surviving evidence concerning medieval baking practice confirms frequently required a baker's genuine presence and activity during the deep, dark hours before sunrise. Guild regulations governing bakers in medieval towns, preserved in reasonably substantial detail across various surviving borough records, occasionally address specifically the early hours at which baking activity might legitimately begin, reflecting official awareness and regulation of exactly this pre-dawn labor pattern, while also, in some surviving cases, addressing concerns regarding the particular fire risk this early activity posed, since a baker's oven, fired and active use during the hours when the great majority of the villagers remained asleep and unaware, represented exactly the kind of unsupervised nighttime fire hazard that broader medieval civic concern regarding fire safety, discussed in earlier accounts, addressed through careful regulation and oversight wherever our community's resources allowed for it. Chapter Yebib, the Church in the Dark Hours. The parish church, standing at the physical and spiritual center of most medieval villages, was rarely entirely without activity even during the deepest hours of the night, particularly in villages associated with a nearby monastic community whose distinctive schedule nighttime prayer discussed. In earlier accounts of medieval religious life, brought monks or nuns from their beds for the demanding service of matins during the deep hours before dawn. Even in villages without directly attached monastic community, the parish priest himself might occasionally be called from sleep during the night, most commonly to attend a parishioner facing serious illness or approaching death, since the administration of the Church's final sacraments discussed. In earlier accounts of medieval, fear surrounding an unprepared death represented an obligation a conscientious priest would fulfill regardless of the hour at which the genuine spiritual need arose. Such a nighttime summons, whether carried by a family member sent running through the dark village lanes or communicated through whatever more organized system of communication a particular community maintained, would have represented one of the more dramatic and clearly memorable interruptions to an otherwise still and silent village night. The priest's own lantern light moving through the darkness toward a troubled household representing, for any villager who happened to observe it, an unmistakable and immediately understood signal that serious illness or death had visited a neighbor during the deep hours when the rest of the community lay peacefully asleep. Chapter 6: When a child was born by candlelight. Childbirth, unpredictable in its timing and demanding immediate attention whenever it began regardless of the hour, represented one of the more genuinely common reasons an ordinarily still medieval village might see meaningful nighttime activity and movement between households. The medieval midwife, typically an experienced woman of the village drawing on practical knowledge passed down through direct experience and informal apprenticeship to more senior practitioners, rather than any formal medical training in the modern sense, would very likely have been summoned at whatever hour labor genuinely began, and surviving evidence concerning medieval childbirth practice confirms that a birthing chamber, once labor was underway, frequently gathered a small group of female relatives, neighbors, and the attending midwife herself, working together through whatever hours the birth itself required, including, quite regularly, the deep hours after midnight. This nighttime activity, illuminated by whatever candles or lamps the household could provide, represented a genuine and meaningful exception to the ordinary stillness of the medieval village night, drawing together a small community of women whose collective knowledge and support carried the household through a moment of genuine danger and significance, since medieval childbirth carried real and well-documented risk to both mother and child. A risk that made the successful, safe completion of a birth, however it might unfold across the deep hours of a single village night, a matter of genuine relief and quiet celebration once morning finally arrived. Chapter 2: Watching beside the sick. Serious illness, much like childbirth, did not confine itself conveniently to daylight hours, and a household facing a family member's genuine medical crisis during the night frequently maintained an active vigil through the darkest hours, tending to the sick person's needs, seeking whatever remedy or comfort medieval medical knowledge and household practice could offer, and where circumstances seemed to warrant it, sending for the priest already discussed in an earlier chapter, or for whatever additional practical, spiritual assistance the wider village community might provide. Surviving household guidance, literature, and the broader medical understanding of the period, including the humoral framework discussed in earlier accounts of medieval health belief, offered specific recommendations regarding the care of the seriously ill, recommendations that a devoted family very likely attempted to follow as best their household's resources allowed, even through the exhausting, uncertain hours of a difficult night. This kind of nighttime sickbed vigil, while leaving relatively limited direct documentary trace in the kind of formal records historians most commonly rely upon for reconstructing medieval daily life, appears with reasonable consistency in the more personal and incidental evidence that does survive, including occasional details preserved within wills, saints' lives describing miraculous healing sought during precisely such nighttime crises, and the broader pattern of communal support already discussed throughout this account, confirming that the deep, quiet hours of a medieval night, however still and undisturbed for the great majority of its sleeping population, could carry genuine and sometimes prolonged crisis for any individual household facing the serious illness of one of its own members. Chapter on those who moved beneath the moon phone for less lawful reasons. Not every villager awake and moving through the darkness after midnight did so for entirely sanctioned purposes, and surviving manorial and forest court records confirm that poaching, the illegal hunting of game reserved by law for the exclusive use of a lord or the crown, represented a genuine and consistently documented category of nighttime rural activity across medieval England and much of continental Europe. The darkness of the deep night offered obvious practical advantage to anyone engaged in this illegal activity, reducing the likelihood of detection by the gamekeepers and forest officials, whose specific responsibility included patrolling against exactly this kind of unauthorized hunting. Surviving court records document numerous specific cases of villagers caught and prosecuted for nighttime poaching offenses, offering historians valuable, concrete evidence of this particular illicit thread running through the otherwise quiet fabric of the medieval village night. Smuggling and other forms of illicit trade seeking to avoid legitimate tolls, taxes, or trading restrictions similarly took advantage of the reduced visibility and diminished official oversight the nighttime hours provided, particularly in villages positioned along significant trade routes. Coastal areas where such illicit movement of goods offered genuine, if legally risky, economic opportunity to villagers willing to accept the considerable danger of detection and prosecution. This darker thread of nighttime village activity, however much a minority pursuit relative to the ordinary sleeping stillness that characterized the great majority of any given village night, confirms that the deep hours after midnight, for all their genuine quiet, were never entirely free of the same tension between lawful order and individual self-interest that shaped so much of medieval daytime life as well. Chapter 11: The sounds that filled the silence. The medieval village night, while profoundly dark, was rarely entirely silent, and the particular sounds that carried through this darkness, audible with unusual clarity, given the near total absence of the competing daytime noise of labor, conversation, and activity, formed their own distinctive nighttime soundscape familiar to every villager who happened to lie briefly awake during the deep hours before dawn. The distant howl of a wolf, particularly in villages situated near substantial woodland and during the colder months, when hunger drove predators closer to human settlement, represented one genuinely documented and understandably unsettling nighttime sound, while the barking of village dogs, responding to this distant howl or to any other disturbance, real or imagined, frequently carried across a sleeping settlement, occasionally waking households and prompting the kind of brief, uneasy alertness before a return to sleep already discussed in earlier accounts of pre-industrial sleep. Patterns. Wind moving through thatched roofs and bare winter branches. The settling creak of timber house frames contracting in the cold. And where livestock shared space near or within village homes, the occasional shifting and low sounds of these animals through the night together formed an ordinary, largely reassuring background texture to the medieval village's deep nighttime hours. Sounds so consistently familiar to villagers accustomed to this particular soundscape that their absence, rather than their presence, would very likely have proven the more immediately alarming and unusual occurrence to anyone who happened to notice it. Chapter 12: The Manor House Through the Night. Where a medieval village stood within the immediate orbit of a manor house, as discussed in earlier accounts of medieval rural social structure, the manor itself frequently maintained its own distinct pattern of nighttime activity, considerably different from the ordinary village household already discussed throughout this account. A substantial manorial household, including numerous servants and retainers in addition to the lord's immediate family, required a degree of continuous nighttime attendance and readiness that a modest peasant household simply did not, with certain servants, as discussed in earlier accounts of. Medieval household service remaining available through much of the night, specifically to respond to any need the lord's family might have. The manor's own hearth, typically larger and more actively maintained than that of an ordinary village home, along with whatever additional security measures a lord's household, considerate, appropriate to its particular status and wealth, meant that the manor house frequently represented, among the small handful of genuinely active points within an otherwise sleeping medieval village landscape, one of the more consistently attended and, relative to the surrounding peasant cottages, more brightly lit locations, its presence a quiet but unmistakable reminder of the considerable disparity in resources, comfort, and continuous nighttime attention that separated a medieval lord's household from the great majority of the ordinary villagers, whose own homes stood, dark and silent, within the manor's broader jurisdiction. Chapter 13. A knock after curfew. The arrival of a traveler seeking shelter after the village's ordinary hours of activity had concluded represented genuine, if relatively infrequent, source of nighttime disturbance within an otherwise quiet settlement, and particular tension surrounding exactly this kind of encounter, discussed in earlier accounts of medieval hospitality, and nighttime caution played out in real, practical terms whenever such an arrival actuated a household roused from sleep by an unexpected knock, whether from a genuinely legitimate traveler delayed by difficult road conditions, failing light, or simple misjudgment of the remaining distance to their intended destination, faced the immediate, practical decision of whether and how to extend the shelter that medieval custom and Christian teaching alike generally encouraged, while still exercising the reasonable caution that any prudent household would bring to admitting an unfamiliar stranger during the vulnerable, poorly supervised hours at night. Village inns, where a settlement's size and position along significant travel routes supported one, offered a somewhat more formal and better prepared solution to exactly this kind of nighttime arrival, maintaining staff and facilities specifically intended to receive travelers whose journey had, for whatever reason, extended past the point at which reaching a planned destination before nightfall had remained possible, though even the most well-prepared village inn, like the ordinary household discussed throughout this chapter, would very likely have experienced this kind of late arrival as a genuine, if not entirely unexpected, interruption to the establishment's own ordinary nighttime rest. Chapter 13. The first grey signs of morning. As the deepest hours of night gradually gave way toward the earliest, still dim light preceding actual sunrise, a medieval village began its own particular, gradual transition back toward the full activity of the coming day, a transition that surviving evidence suggests followed a reasonably predictable pattern shaped by the practical demands of medieval agricultural and craft labor. The crowing of village roosters, among the most immediately recognizable and consistently documented signals,
marking this transition across virtually every surviving account of medieval rural life, provided unnatural, freely available signal understood by the entire community as marking genuine approach of the working day, prompting the earliest raisers including those whose occupations, discussed in earlier chapters, already required pre-dawn activity to complete their final preparations before the village's broader population began stirring from sleep. This gradual transition from the deep stillness of the true night toward the full activity of the coming day represented, in its own way, one of the most consistently repeated rhythms of medieval village life, a daily cycle experienced in its essential outline by countless generations of villagers across the many centuries of the medieval period, each of them waking, in their turn, to begin the day's labor within a community whose fundamental nighttime pattern, from the ringing of the curfew bell through the watchman's careful rounds, the banked hearth's quiet smolder, and the earliest pre-dawn stirrings of miller and baker alike, remained remarkably consistent across the long span of medieval history. Chapter Auberge, a village that never truly slept alone. The story of a medieval village after midnight is, in its fullest sense, a story about the quiet, largely invisible infrastructure of care, labor, and vigilance that continued, even while the great majority of a community's people peacefully asleep. The watchman's steady rounds, the miller's early preparation, the baker's pre-dawn labor, the midwife's careful attendance at a difficult birth, and the priest's willingness to answer a nocturne summons to a dying parishioner's bedside, together reveal a village that was never truly and entirely asleep, but rather a community sustained hour after hour by a small, rotating group of people whose particular responsibilities required them to remain awake and active precisely during the hours when everyone else could safely rest. This quiet nighttime activity, largely unrecorded in its ordinary, unremarkable form yet reconstructible through the patient combination of manorial record, guild regulation, chronicled anecdote, and comparative historical evidence that this account has drawn upon throughout, reveals a genuinely important truth about medieval community life more broadly, that the safety, order, and basic functioning of even the smallest and most ordinary medieval village depended, every single night, on precisely this kind of careful, distributed vigilance, a village never entirely without watchful eyes. Working hunts, even in its very deepest, darkest, and most silent hours. Chapter Umnox, the shepherd beneath the stars. Among the village occupations, since most directly and unavoidably tied to genuine, sustained nighttime presence outdoors, was that of the shepherd, whose flocks required protection through the night against predators, straying, and, during the particularly demanding season of lambing, the close, hence, continuous attention that a difficult birth among the flock might require at any hour. Surviving agricultural treatises and manorial records from across medieval England and continental Europe confirm that shepherds frequently maintained genuine overnight or night vigil with their flocks, particularly during the spring lambing season, when then survival of born lambs against cold, predation, and the ordinary complications of birth depended directly on a shepherd's continuous, attentive presence through the night. This overnight shepherding, conducted often at some physical distance from the village itself, in the surrounding pasture land where flocks grazed, placed the shepherd in a genuinely distinct category among the village's nighttime population, someone whose ordinary working life required regular, sustained exposure to exactly the kind of nighttime darkness, isolation, and physical hardship that the great majority of villagers, safely asleep within their own homes, experienced only rarely, if at all. Surviving folklore and popular literary tradition frequently associates the shepherd with a particular closeness to the mysteries and dangers of the night sky and countryside more broadly, an association that, whatever its more romantic later literary elaboration, reflects a genuine underlying historical reality regarding the shepherd's distinctly nocturnal working life within the broader rhythm of medieval village society. Chapter on Yidi, when the forge glowed past sunset. The village blacksmith, whose forge fire, once discussed in earlier accounts of medieval trades, required considerable heat and sustained tending to remain useful for metalworking, occasionally extended his working hours in the evening and, on particular occasions of urgent need, into the deeper hours of night as well, particularly when a genuinely pressing repair, such as a broken plow essential to the following day's agricultural labor, or urgent iron work needed for some other pressing communal purpose, could not reasonably wait for the ordinary working hours of the following day. Surviving guild records addressing blacksmithing across medieval Europe occasionally reference regulation of working hours, inking hours, including restrictions intended to balance the genuine occasional necessity of extended or nighttime forge work against the broader civic concern regarding fire safety already discussed throughout this account. A forge fire glowing through the evening or into the deeper hours of night represented one of the more visually striking exceptions to the ordinary darkness of the medieval village after sunset. Its light and the accompanying sound of hammer against anvil carrying through the otherwise still settlement and offering, to any villager who happened to notice it, an immediately recognizable signal that some particular urgent need drawn the blacksmith to his forge outside the ordinary hours his trade typically observed, a signal that, depending on the specific circumstance, might indicate anything from a genuinely welcome sign of urgent problem being addressed to a source of the same underlying fire anxiety that shaped so much of medieval civic nighttime regulation more broadly. Chapter Onsets, seasons of longer and shorter dark. The particular character and rhythm of a medieval village's nighttime hours varied considerably across the turning of the agricultural year, since the sheer length of the night itself, and correspondingly the length of the working day preceding and following it, shifted dramatically between the short summer nights of the longest days and the long, dark winter nights already discussed in inconsiderable detail in earlier accounts of medieval winter survival. During the height of summer, when daylight extended long into what would, during winter months, already have been full darkness. The period of genuine village night to nighttime stillness compressed considerably with agricultural labor, particularly during the demanding harvest season, occasionally extending village activity well into the later evening hours as villagers raced to bring in a harvest before weather or the natural ripening cycle of their crops forced their hand. Winter, by contrast, brought the long nights already extensively discussed throughout earlier accounts of medieval winter life, compressing the working day considerably and, correspondingly, extending the genuine hours of village nighttime stillness that this broader account has sought to describe. A seasonal variation that meant the specific character of any given medieval village's night after night to midnight depended considerably on which particular point in the agricultural calendar a given observation might fall, from the brief, urgent darkness of a midsummer harvest night to the long, quiet stretch of a December night that offered, by comparison, considerably more genuine hours of settled village stillness before the demands of the following days shortened. Daylight required the community's attention once again. Chapter on Dokst, the well and the common oven by night. Jordan shared communal resources within a medieval village, occasionally limited nighttime use under particular circumstances, offering historians additional insight into the genuine, if infrequent, activity that could interrupt on otherwise sleeping settlements' ordinary stillness. The village well, serving as the primary water source for a community lacking convenient access to a stream or river, might occasionally see a villager drawing water during the night in response to some particular household need, whether tending a sick family member, as discussed in an earlier chapter, or addressing some other pressing domestic requirement that could not reasonably wait until the well's more ordinary hours of daytime use. The communal oven, discussed in earlier accounts of medieval food preparation and already touched upon in relation to the baker's early morning activity, similarly saw its own particular pattern of use extending into the pre-dawn hours, since a communal oven serving numerous households across us village required careful scheduling, and very often the kind of pre-dawn firing and preparation already discussed in relation to individual bakers, ensuring the oven had reached appropriate baking temperature by the time the village's households began arriving with their own dough for the day's baking, a nearly practical necessity that placed whoever held responsibility for the communal oven's operation among the small, consistent group of village residents whose ordinary occupation required regular activity during the deep, dark hours before the rest of their community had risen. Sleep. Chapter even what archaeology tells us out the village night. Much of what historians understand about the physical layout and organization of a medieval village, information essential to reconstructing how its nighttime hours genuinely functioned, comes from the patient-paced archaeological excavation of medieval village sites across England and continental Europe, many of which, particularly The deserted medieval villages abandoned following the demographic and economic upheavals of the later medieval period have provided historians with unusually complete and undisturbed physical evidence of house placement, boundary markers, and the broader spatial organization of settlements, whose ordinary daily and nightly rhythms this account has sought throughout to describe. This archaeological evidence, combined with the documentary sources already discussed throughout this account, allows historians to reconstruct with reasonable confidence the physical spaces within which the nighttime activities described in this account actually unfolded, including the relative placement of the parish church, any manor house, the village well, and the ordinary peasant houses whose close, practical proximity to one another, evident and in the physical layout, revealed by archaeological excavation, confirms the genuinely close, interconnected character of medieval village community life discussed throughout this broader history, a community whose members, even while individually asleep within their or own separate households, remained physically and socially bound together within a settlement small and closely built enough that any genuine nighttime disturbance, whether a fire's first spark, a birth's difficult labor, or a watchman's call, could reasonably be expected to reach and involve the wider community with considerable speed. Chapter Yimbibir, Festival Nights that broke the pattern. Certain nights across the medieval calendar, as discussed in earlier accounts of medieval youthful nighttime celebration, brought deliberate, sanctioned exception to the ordinary pattern of village nighttime stillness. This account has otherwise described transforming an ordinarily silent settlement into a genuine center of nighttime activity, light, and communal gathering. Midsummer bonfires are already discussed in earlier accounts of medieval festival custom, drew villagers of every age from their ordinary evening routine into shared celebration, extending well past the hour at which an ordinary village night would otherwise have settled into its characteristic stillness. The light and sound of such gatherings carrying through the settlement in a manner sharply distinct from the deep quiet that governed the great majority of the year's ordinary nights. Harvest celebrations, similarly extending village activity into the evening, and occasionally the deeper nighttime hours, during the demanding but genuinely celebratory conclusion of the agricultural year's most critical labor. And the wedding celebrations discussed in earlier accounts of medieval youthful life together confirm that the ordinarily still and quiet medieval village night this account has represented a genuine pattern rather than an absolute rule, one deliberately and periodically interrupted by sanctioned communal celebration that briefly transformed the settlement's nighttime character entirely before the following morning's return to ordinary labor restored the village to its more typical rhythm of quiet, orderly nighttime rest. Chapter Yimiki, the Bailiff's Watch and the Manor's Interest. The manorial bailiff, responsible for overseeing the practical management of a lord's estate and ensuring that peasants fulfilled their various labor and financial obligations, occasionally maintained his own particular interest in a village's nighttime activity, since matters including unauthorized nighttime hunting or gathering on the Lord's protected woodland, already discussed in an earlier chapter concerning poaching, fell directly within his practical jurisdiction and responsibility to the manor's broader economic interests. Surviving manorial court records document instances in which a bailiff or the gamekeepers and foresters working under his broader authority specifically patrolled or investigated nighttime activity on manorial land, reflecting the genuine, practical extension of manorial economic interest into exactly the deep, dark hours. This account has as otherwise described as largely free of active oversight beyond the village's own limited watch arrangements. This manorial nighttime interest, while considerably less consistently documented than the more routine civic watch arrangements already discussed in earlier chapters, confirms that the deep quiet of a medieval village night existed within a broader web of manorial authority and economic interest that did not entirely cease its attention simply because the ordinary working day had concluded, a pattern consistent with the broader manorial oversight of village life discussed throughout earlier accounts of medieval rural social structure, extended here into the specific, if more occasionally documented, context of the village's own nighttime hours. Chapter Emuch, the dog that did not bark. The village dog, kept by many medieval households both for practical assistance with herding and hunting, and for the genuine, well-recognized value of warning its bark, provided
against approaching strangers, animals, or fire, represented an important and consistently documented feature of medieval village nighttime security. One that, while informal and entirely unofficial compared to the organized watch system already discussed throughout this account, nonetheless offered genuine additional protection to the households that kept such animals. Surviving literary references and folk tradition from across medieval Europe reflect a broadly shared cultural awareness of the dog's particular value as a nighttime sentinel, its bark serving as one of the most immediate and universally recognized signals of disturbance within an otherwise quiet settlement. The absence of this expected barking, precisely because village dogs were so consistently relied upon to provide exactly this kind of nighttime alert, could itself carry particular significance. A pattern of reasoning reflected in various surviving folk tales and proverbial tradition from across medieval and later European culture that specifically address the meaningful absence of unexpected warning sign, confirming that medieval villagers, whatever their formal reliance on the more organized watch system already discussed throughout this account, also depended in genuine, practical ways on the informal, distributed nighttime vigilance that the ordinary presence of village dogs spread across numerous individual households provided to the wider settlement as a whole. Chapter 24, when the weather itself kept watch. The particular character of our medieval village's nighttime hours depended considerably on prevailing weather conditions, which shaped both the genuine practical dangers villagers faced after dark and the specific sensory experience of moving through or simply lying awake within a settlement during the deep hours of night. A clear, moonlit night, as discussed in earlier accounts of medieval lunar belief, offered genuinely valuable additional illumination to anyone required to move through the village or surrounding countryside after dark, while a night of heavy cloud cover, rain, or snow correspondingly deepened the profound darkness already characteristic of the medieval night, compounding the genuine practical difficulty facing a watchman on his rounds, a shepherd tending his flock, or any other villager whose particular circumstance required nighttime movement or activity. Severe weather, including the genuinely dangerous winter storms discussed in earlier accounts of medieval winter survival, brought its own particular intensification of nighttime concern, since a storm striking during the deep hours of night, when a household's capacity to respond to structural damage, fire risk from a damaged chimney or hearth, or the danger facing any livestock housed nearby, remaining genuinely limited by darkness and the practical difficulty of nighttime repair or rescue, represented one of the more genuinely frightening categories of medieval village nighttime experience, connecting the ordinary, largely peaceful stillness. This account has generally described to the same underlying vulnerability to genuine environmental danger that shaped so much of medieval rural life more broadly. Chapter Base, The Legacy of the Village Night. The story of a medieval village after midnights, in its fullest and final sense, a story about the quiet, remarkably consistent rhythm that governed the great majority of medieval rural life across many centuries and countless individual settlements. A item built from careful preparation, distributed communal responsibility, and a genuine, practical wisdom accumulated across generations regarding exactly how a small, closely built community could safely and successfully pass through the vulnerable hours of darkness that separated one working day from the next. The watchman's steady rounds, the shepherd's overnight vigil among the flocks, the baker and miller's pre-dawn labor, and the ordinary, largely undisturbed sleep of the great majority of the village's population together formed a pattern remarkably stable across the long span of the medieval period, interrupted only occasionally by genuine crises, sanctioned festival celebration, or the particular demands of a difficult birth, a serious illness, or an unexpected traveler's late arrival. This deeply consistent nighttime pattern, reconstructed through the patient combination of documentary and archaeological evidence this account has drawn upon throughout, offers a genuinely valuable window into the fundamental character of medieval rural community life more broadly, revealing society whose survival and continued functioning depended every single night across many centuries on exactly this kind of careful, distributed vigilance, and quiet, unglamorous labor carried out by a small rotating group of villagers, while the great majority of their neighbors rested safely in the shared warmth and darkness of their own modest homes, trusting as medieval villagers had trusted for generations before them, that the accumulated wisdom and mutual care of their community would see them safely through to another morning. Thank you for listening. See you in the next stories. Please subscribe and leave a comment.